Close your eyes. Let your body settle into wherever you are right now. The blanket, the pillow, the quiet weight of a day coming to an end. I want to take you somewhere tonight. Somewhere far from here. Far from the noise and the speed and the endless flickering of screens. I want to take you north. Very far north. To a time over 1,000 years ago, when the world was darker, colder, and in many ways much, much quieter. When most people hear the word Viking, they picture something very specific. A longship cutting through dark water. A horned helmet, though. Historically, those didn't exist. A warrior with a massive axe raising it toward a burning skyline. Screaming. Fire, the crash of waves and the clash of iron. That image exists. Those people existed. The raids happened. But here's what the movies never told you. The vast majority of people who lived in Norse Scandinavia during the Viking Age, that remarkable period stretching roughly from 793 to 10 CC 6 CE, were not raiders. They were not warriors. They never crossed the North Sea. They never saw the inside of an English monastery. They were farmers. They woke before the sun. They milked animals in the gray pre-dawn cold. They spent their afternoons knee-deep in muddy fields, or bent over wooden looms, or standing at a smoking fire stirring rendered fat. They went to bed tired in ways that we, in our cushioned modern lives, can barely imagine. And then they got up and did it all over again. Tonight, we're going to live 1 year in the life of one of these forgotten people. A bondi, that's the Old Norse word for a free farmer, a landholder, someone who owned a small plot of land and worked it with their family. Not a king, not a jarl, not a famous explorer whose name was carved into runestones. Just a person, living a life. In a cold, beautiful, demanding land. Let the day release you. You don't need to hold on to anything tonight. Just listen. Just breathe. We're going north. To understand a Viking Age farmer's life, you first need to understand the farm. And it looked almost nothing like what we picture when we hear the word farm today. There were no red barns, no neat white fences, no organized rows of identical crops disappearing into the horizon. The Norse farm, called a bu in Old Norse, was a cluster of low, long buildings, usually built directly into the landscape. Sometimes dug partially into a hillside to keep them warm. Sometimes built on a slight rise above a fjord to catch the wind and give a view of approaching strangers. The main building was called the Longhouse. And if you've ever seen a reconstruction of one, you know they're striking in a particular way. Not tall or grand, but long, very long. Some stretched 40, 50, even 60 feet from one end to the other. The walls were built from wood and turf, thick slabs of grass-covered earth stacked like bricks, providing remarkable insulation against the Scandinavian winter. The roof was also turf, heavy and grass-covered, so that from a distance, the Longhouse sometimes looked less like a building and more like a low green hill with smoke drifting from a hole in its spine. Inside, the Longhouse was one long, open space, at least in its simplest form. Down the center ran a long fire pit, sometimes called a langilder, the long fire. This fire burned all day, every day, throughout the colder months. It was everything: heat, light, a surface for cooking, a gathering place in the evenings. The smoke curled upward and found its way out through gaps in the roof, or through that central smoke hole, but not always quickly. Longhouses were smoky places. The people who lived in them accepted that. Over time, their clothes and hair carried the smell of wood smoke, the way ours carry the smell of laundry soap and coffee. Along both long walls ran raised wooden platforms. These were the sleeping benches. The family slept here, often together, often wrapped in wool blankets and animal furs. There was no separate bedroom privacy, in the modern sense, barely existed. The family lived together, slept together, and worked together in this one long room. At one end of the longhouse, or sometimes in an attached wing, was the byre. This was the animal shelter. In winter, the cattle, and sometimes the sheep and goats, were brought inside to share the longhouse with the family. This sounds strange to us, but it was entirely practical. The animals generated significant body heat. A longhouse full of cattle was a warmer longhouse, and the farmer could tend to a sick animal at midnight without stepping outside into blizzard conditions. Around the main longhouse were typically smaller outbuildings, a separate forge if the family was prosperous enough, a small bathhouse called a badstuga, which would have been used regularly for sweating and bathing, storage buildings for hay, grain, and equipment, perhaps a small smithy, or a pit for storing root vegetables through winter. The whole farm compound was a self-contained world. Everything needed to survive: food, warmth, tools, clothing either came from this land or was made by these hands. Let that settle in for a moment. Every piece of cloth on their bodies was made here. Every tool in their hand was shaped here. Every bite of food was grown, gathered, or raised within walking distance of this door. Close your eyes a little tighter. The fire pops. The wind moves outside. You are inside, and it is warm, and somewhere nearby a cow shifts her weight in the straw. The Norse year did not begin in January. Not really. Not in any way that mattered to the body. The Norse year began when the light came back. After months of darkness, and in the far north of Scandinavia, we mean true darkness, the kind where the sun barely lifts above the horizon before sinking again. The gradual lengthening of days was a profound event. It was felt physically, emotionally. The world, which had contracted inward through the long winter, began to breathe again. This was the season the Norse called vor, spring, and there was no time to waste. The first task of spring was an inventory of survival. The farmer and his family would take stock of what had made it through the winter. How much grain remained in the storage pits? How many of the cattle had survived? Were the seed stores intact, or had mice found their way in? If the winter had been harsh, and many were, this inventory could be a sober, frightening exercise. Cattle that had grown thin through the cold months, fed on the last dusty remnants of the hay stores. Grain supplies running thin. The family itself thinner, their bodies having burned through fat reserves through the dark months. The farmers called the period between February and April the hungry gap, the stretch, when last year's stores were running out, but the new year's food hadn't yet grown. This was when people thinned their porridge with water, when they might slaughter a weak animal rather than wait for it to die. It was not starvation, not usually, but it was a lean and careful time. And then the thaw came. And the ground, which had been iron hard since autumn, began to soften. This is when everything became urgent. Plowing a Viking Age field was brutally hard work. The Norse used an ard, a simple wooden plow, sometimes tipped with iron, that scratched rather than turned the soil. It required an ox or a horse to pull, and a man to guide it, and the work was done in a kind of lurching rhythm, as the plow caught roots and rocks, and resisted, and then gave way. Fields were typically plowed twice, once in one direction, then again at a right angle, a technique called cross-plowing, which helped break up the soil more thoroughly. The farmer walked behind the plow all day, and the next day, and the day after that. What did they grow? The primary grain crops were barley and rye, with oats in wetter regions. Barley was especially important. It could be ground into flour for flatbreads, brewed into ale, or cooked into a dense, filling porridge that formed the base of most meals. Rye was hardier and could survive colder, thinner soils. Oats fed people and animals alike. They also grew flax both for its seeds, which were pressed for oil, and for its fibers, which would eventually become linen. Flax required significant processing, soaking, drying, beating, combing, a long chain of labor before it became anything you could wear, and they kept kitchen gardens closer to the Longhouse cabbages, onions, peas, beans, herbs like yarrow and wild garlic and thyme. The animals were let out to pasture as soon as the grass came in, often a moment celebrated with some small ceremony, or at least a collective exhale. Cattle that had been cooped up all winter needed movement and fresh grass, and the family needed the byre cleaned out. The accumulated manure from months of winter, and there was a great deal of it, was spread on the fields as fertilizer, completing the cycle. Children helped with everything. There is no indication from the archaeological record that Viking Age children had childhoods that looked anything like what we associate with childhood today. By the age of 5 or 6, a child was already an economic participant in the household. They scared birds away from newly planted fields. They helped guide animals. They fetched water, gathered fuel, fed chickens. Learning happened through doing from the very beginning. The women of the household held a particular kind of power in this season. In Norse society, the mistress of the household, the husfrigga, carried the keys to the Longhouse stores. A large ring of iron keys was one of the defining symbols of a free Norse woman's status, and archaeologists have found them in women's graves again and again. She controlled what was eaten and when. She decided when the last of the winter grain was spent and when to begin the new supply. In a world where food was survival, this was real authority. Breathe. Feel the cool spring air. Somewhere below you, seeds are sitting in cold, dark soil, beginning to awaken. The world is very old and very slow, and tonight you can be slow with it. If you have never been to Scandinavia in summer, it's difficult to convey what the light is like. It does not get fully dark. At midsummer, the sky in southern Norway doesn't get darker than a deep twilight. In the far north, the sun circles the horizon for weeks without setting. This was deeply meaningful to the Norse people, a connection to the divine, to the turning of a cosmic wheel that they couldn't control but could participate in. Midsummer in the old language was one of the most important celebrations of the year. Fires were lit on hilltops. People gathered. There was probably music, drinking, feasting from the first real produce of the season. Young people stayed up through the brief dimming of the sky and watched the sun return. But the celebration lasted perhaps a day. Then it was back to work. Because summer in the Norse world was not a time to rest. Summer was the time to do everything that would determine whether you lived through next winter. The single most important summer task was the hay harvest. Hay sounds unremarkable. It's just dried grass. But hay was quite literally the difference between life and death for northern farmers. Without hay stored before winter, the cattle had nothing to eat through the cold months. And without cattle, you had no milk, no meat, no draft animals for next year's plowing. The whole chain collapsed. Haymaking required the entire family and often the help of neighbors. When the grass in the meadows was tall and still had its nutrition locked inside before it went to seed and became less digestible, you cut it. all of it, as fast as possible. Because the weather in Scandinavia was unpredictable, and every day you lost to rain was a day, the cut grass was rotting instead of drying. They cut with long iron scythes, swinging in rhythmic arcs that blistered hands and ached through the lower back by midday. Women and children spread the cut grass to dry. You turned it regularly, fluffing it to allow air through. When it was dry, truly dry, you gathered it and stored it in the hay barn, or stacked it outside in careful ricks that shed rain from the top. While the men focused on the hay and the larger fields, the women managed a continuous stream of other summer work. Dairying was relentless. Cows were milked twice a day, every day. The milk was processed some drunk fresh, but much of it transformed. Skyra thick, tangy fermented dairy product that's still made in Iceland today was a way of preserving the nutrition of summer milk well into winter. Butter was churned, packed into wooden tubs, and sometimes buried in peat bogs, where the cold and acidic environment preserved it remarkably well. Archaeologists have excavated bog butter in Ireland and Scotland, barrels of butter buried 1,000 years ago, still technically edible. Fishing was part of summer too. Norse farms near fjords or rivers had access to salmon, trout, herring, and cod. Fish were smoked, dried, or fermented, a long process that created intense, pungent, highly caloric food that could be stored for months. Dried cod, beaten against a rock to soften it, became a staple that could sustain you through the coldest weeks. Children gathered. Berries appeared in the forests in late summer: bilberries, cloudberries, wild strawberries, lingonberries. These were eaten fresh when possible and preserved when not, boiled down into thick fruit preparations, mixed with animal fat, fermented. The Norse palate was broadly comfortable with fermented and acidic flavors in a way that modern Western taste has largely moved away from. In the evenings, when the long summer light finally dimmed slightly and the work slowed, the weaving happened. Textile production was one of the most significant economic activities of the Viking Age household, and it fell almost entirely to women. Every scrap of fabric in a Norse household was made by hand. The wool had to be shorn from sheep, cleaned, combed, or carded, spun into yarn, and then woven on a vertical loom. The Norse warp-weighted looms stood upright, with stone or ceramic weights hanging from the warp threads to keep them taut. A skilled weaver could produce cloth of surprisingly high quality, fine enough to wear to a ceremony, dense enough to keep out a North Atlantic wind. A single garment took weeks. A cloak, weeks more. The women of the household were in a constant, never-ending cycle of textile production. Because cloth wore out, children grew out of their clothes, and wool was one of the primary items traded at markets. We have evidence that some Norse women were master craftswomen. Buried with their spindle whorls and their weaving tablets, the quality of their tools suggests pride, expertise, and years of practice. Their work was not invisible. It was essential. Let the warmth of summer settle over you. The light is still in the sky. You've worked hard today. Somewhere, a loom is being set aside. Someone is stirring a pot. The fire is low and orange, and the first stars are just beginning to appear. Autumn is when the Norse farm entered its most intense period. Everything was converging at once. The grain was ready to harvest. The animals needed to be evaluated. The firewood stores needed building. The last fruit and vegetables needed to be preserved. And underneath all of it ran a single, quiet anxiety: winter is coming. It always comes. Are we ready? The grain harvest was a communal effort. Neighbors helped neighbors. A practice called a visla in some contexts, a kind of reciprocal labor exchange that wove the community together. You helped bring in my harvest. I helped bring in yours. Nobody's crops could wait for you to finish your own. Grain was cut with iron sickles, curved blades that fit the hand, and allowed you to grab a bunch of stalks and slice through them with a single stroke. The cut grain was bundled and left standing in sheaves to dry further in the field. Then it was brought in, threshed, beaten against a frame or a stone to separate the grain from the stalk, and winnowed. Winnowing meant throwing the grain into the air on a windy day and letting the wind carry away the lighter chaff while the heavy grain fell back into the basket. Simple, effective, and done standing outdoors in autumn wind, which was not nothing. The grain was then stored in sunken pits lined with clay or wicker, or in raised granaries designed to keep out moisture and rodents. The security of those grain stores was the security of the family. But autumn also meant something harder. Not all the animals could be fed through winter. The hay stores were finite. The choice of which animals to keep: the healthiest cows, the most productive ewes. The strongest bull meant that others had to be slaughtered. The autumn slaughter was called the Blot in Old Norse, a word that also carried religious connotations. The killing of animals in autumn was in many ways understood as a sacred act, a returning of life to the earth in exchange for what the earth had given. Blood was probably sprinkled on the fields and the Longhouse posts. There may have been prayers or invocations to the gods, particularly to Freyr, the god of fertility and abundance. But beyond the ritual, the slaughter was intensely practical. The meat had to be processed immediately. Some of it was smoked over low, slow fires of green wood and aromatic herbs. Some was salted. Salt was precious, traded from coastal regions, hoarded carefully. Some meat was dried and wind-cured, hung from the rafters of the longhouse where smoke and cool air gradually turned it into something that would last months. Blood sausages were made. Organs were cooked and eaten first. Nothing was wasted. Fat was rendered and stored. Bones were boiled for hours until they gave up every calorie they contained. The entirety of an animal was used. The skin became leather. The sinews became thread. Even the stomach lining might become a bag or a cooking vessel. Fermentation was another key preservation technique. Fruits, vegetables, and dairy were all fermented in clay pots and wooden barrels, producing acidic, probiotic-rich foods that were nutritionally valuable and shelf-stable. The Norse were sophisticated fermenters, and their household stores in autumn would have held an array of carefully tended crocks and barrels, each one a small experiment in controlled decay. There is a particular quality to late autumn light in Scandinavia that people who've experienced it never quite forget. The sun is low even at midday, cutting sideways through golden birch trees. The air is cold and clear and smells of wood smoke and wet earth. There's a beauty to it, but also a reckoning. You can feel in it the approach of darkness. The firewood had to be right, not just cut seasoned. Wood that had been cut the previous year and spent the summer drying was what you burned this winter. Wood cut this autumn would be too green, too wet, burning badly, and smoking heavily. The woodpile was an investment in future winters as much as the present one. Norse families prepared mushrooms, hung in strings to dry. They gathered nuts and acorns where available. They pressed whatever apples or wild plums grew in their area into juice that would eventually ferment. They dried herbs that would season food and, in some cases, treat illness through the dark months when no fresh plant material could be gathered. By the time the first hard frost crystallized the mud in the farmyard and turned the last leaves bronze and black, the farm should have been ready. Ideally. The family had done everything they could. Now came the true test. You are getting sleepy. That is all right. The autumn work is done. The stores are full, or as full as they'll be. The door is thick. The fire is burning. Let your body rest. Norse winter in the 9th and 10th century was not like modern winter. There was no electric light to push back the dark. No central heating to keep rooms at a consistent warm temperature. No grocery store to supplement when the stores ran thin. The darkness was real, hours and hours of it every day. The cold was structural, the kind that required constant management just to survive. And yet, winter was in many ways the richest time of the internal life. The frantic labor of spring and summer and autumn was over. The work of winter was slower, more contemplative. It was the season of making, of repairing and crafting and creating, and also the season of story. The Norsemen spent winter in the forge, in the woodshop, in the repair of equipment that had worn and broken over the working year. A plow that had cracked in the autumn, a scythe handle that had split, barrels that needed recuperated, their staves reseated and re-hooped with iron. Tools were cleaned, oiled, and sharpened. Leather harnesses were repaired, stitched back together with sinew or thin strips of rawhide. Wooden bowls and utensils were carved, a calm, meditative practice that produced useful objects from material that cost nothing but time. The Norse were accomplished woodworkers. The same traditions that produced the elegant longship also produced beautifully carved furniture, intricate knotwork panels, and finally made tool handles decorated with geometric patterns. The winter gave time for this craft, for the slow, patient work of the blade against wood, the steady rhythm of the carving mallet. The women wove. Through all the dark months, the loom stood against the Longhouse wall, and the weaving continued. Winter was when the backlog of summer's wool could finally be worked into cloth, when the tablet weaving, a technique using small perforated cards to create intricate geometric patterns, could be practiced, producing decorative bands for the edges of garments. For trade, bone and antler were carved into combs, needles, pins, handles, game pieces. Amber, if the family had access to it, was worked into beads. Soapstone soft enough to carve with iron tools was shaped into lamps, weights for looms, and small vessels. The children played, and even this was instructive. Norse games included Histowhispa, a strategy board game played on a grid, not unlike chess, which trained tactical thinking. Dice games were popular. Riddles and wordplay were practiced. The Norse had a sophisticated tradition of kennings, those compound poetic metaphors that called the sea the whale road and gold fire of the sea. A child who could compose a clever kenning had demonstrated a kind of intelligence that was valued. And there were the stories. The long evenings of winter were when the oral tradition truly lived. We know the stories as the Eddas and the sagas, but in the Viking Age farmhouse, they existed as living, breathing performances around a fire. An elder would tell the story of how Odin hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 days to earn the knowledge of the runes. Of how Thor once dressed as a bride to retrieve his stolen hammer, Mugralnir. Of the great heroes Sigurd and Gunnar, and the doom that falls on those who reach too greedily for cursed gold. These weren't just entertainment. They were instruction. They were a way of transmitting values, the importance of honor, the danger of greed, the inevitability of fate, the stubborn dignity of facing what comes without flinching. They were also a way of making the darkness companionable. The fire burned and the voices rose and fell, and the winter was long, but it was not entirely empty. The Norse celebrated the winter solstice Jul, which is where our word Yule comes from, as a major feast. It marked the sun's return, the turn of the year's wheel back toward light. Ale was brewed for this occasion. A special animal, perhaps a boar dedicated to Freyr, might be sacrificed. There was feasting, and toasts to the gods and the spirits of the land, and perhaps gifts exchanged, and fires lit against the dark. The midwinter feast was a promise. We have survived this far. The light is turning. We will be here to plant again in spring. Let your breath slow. The fire in the center of the Longhouse has burned down to embers now. Everyone is on their benches wrapped in wool. Someone mutters softly in their sleep. A dog shifts near the warmth. Outside, the wind moves over the snow-covered hills and finds no purchase, and the stars are extraordinary through the smoke hole in the roof. You are warm. You are fed. You made it through. Before we let the night take us entirely, let's talk about food. Because the food of the Viking Age farmer tells you almost everything about who they were. The primary staple was porridge. Not the instant oat kind. A thick, dark, dense porridge of coarsely ground barley or rye, simmered for a long time over the fire in a heavy clay or iron pot, stirred with a wooden paddle until it became almost solid. It was flavored with salt if you had it, with onion or garlic, sometimes with dried fish or a piece of smoked meat. It was not glamorous. It was not exciting. But it was caloric, filling, and could be kept warm all day at the edge of the fire so that anyone who came in from outside work could eat without ceremony. Bread was also common dark flatbreads, unleavened or lightly leavened with fermented grain, baked directly on hearthstones or in clay vessels set in the fire's coals. The flour was whole grain, the bread dense and heavy and substantial, in a way our refined white loaves are not. Dairy was central. Milk when available, but more often fermented dairy skyr, soft cheeses, whey drinks. The skyr in particular was a nutritional powerhouse high in protein, thick enough to eat with a spoon, tangy and filling. We know from Icelandic sagas that skyr was considered important enough to be specifically mentioned in descriptions of meals. Meat was consumed, but not as frequently as we might imagine. Cattle were too valuable alive for milk, for labor to slaughter casually. Pork was probably more common, as pigs could be efficiently fattened on scraps and required less care than cattle. Mutton and lamb were seasonal. Venison and wild game supplemented the diet for those who hunted. Fish, as I mentioned, was critical. Dried cod and herring could be stored indefinitely and provided good protein through the winter months when fresh meat was unavailable. The Norse were skilled fishermen, and coastal communities ate fish in enormous quantities. Ale was consumed daily. This was not recreational drinking, it was practical. Ale, made from malted barley, was safer to drink than untreated water from streams that were often contaminated near farm settlements. It provided calories. It was part of every meal from morning to night. The Norse ale was probably lower in alcohol than modern beers, but it was real and it was constant. Cooking happened over the open fire, using clay pots, iron cauldrons, and hearthstones. There were no ovens in most farmhouses. Techniques included boiling, roasting on spits, and baking directly in embers. The Norse cook, generally the woman of the household, was constantly managing this fire, adjusting heat by moving pots closer or further, replenishing water in the cauldron, checking on the long simmering porridge. They used herbs. Juniper berries for seasoning and preservation, wild caraway, thyme, garlic mustard. The flavors were probably intense and unfamiliar to a modern palate. Smoky, fermented, strongly herbed, sour, salty. But they were good. The evidence of bones and seeds and kitchen middens tells us these people were not starving, not in good years. They were well-fed, physically robust. Their diets surprisingly varied when the seasons allowed. They ate together. The family at the fire's edge, sharing food from common pots. This was the center of the day. Everything else orbited around it. We've spent a year on this farm tonight. We've plowed and planted, milked and churned. Cut hay under the long summer sun, watched the frost come and the last leaves fall, sat by the fire as the stories were told and the winter settled like a heavy blanket over the world. The people who lived these lives had names. Some of them were recorded: a merchant who traded amber at a market in Hedeby, a woman whose grave goods told archaeologists. She was a skilled textile worker, a man whose runestone was raised by his sons in a Gotland churchyard. Most of them we will never know. They are gone entirely from memory. Not a single word that passed from their mouths was written down. Not a single feeling they had on a cold October morning, watching the first snow arrive on the hills, was preserved. But the things they made survive. The whorls of their spindles, smooth from years of turning in a hand that is now dust. The iron plowshare, rusted to almost nothing in a waterlogged field. The outline of a longhouse pressed into the earth where the turf walls slowly collapsed over centuries. The faint traces of a kitchen garden in the pattern of soil chemistry. These traces say we were here. We worked. We ate. We slept. We worried about the winter and celebrated the summer and told our children stories by firelight. We lived lives that were hard and short and full and real. History is mostly them, not the kings. Not the famous raiders whose names filled the pages of English monastic chronicles. The people who made it across are the interesting ones in the movies, but the people who stayed home and kept the world running, they are the ones who made everything possible. Tonight, somewhere in the darkness, their fields are under other fields. Their longhouses are under other houses. The fjord that their grandchildren looked at every morning still moves with the same cold, dark, beautiful water. Sleep now. The farm is quiet. The fire is low. You have done good work.